Part 1. The Dogon Tribe, Sirius B, and Dolphins. There is an African tribe near Timbuktu called the Dogons, who hold information that would be absolutely impossible to know according to today's standards. See, the Dogons have a cave on their land that stretches back into a mountain, and in this cave are drawings over 700 years old. Now, the brightest star in the sky to us is called Sirius, now called Sirius A. If you look at Orion's belt, following it downwards to your left, you can see it. The information in the Dogon cave specifically showed the star Sirius. They're very specific about the star, and they have a diagram of not just Sirius' rotational pattern, but a small star orbiting it. They say it's very, very old and very small, and made out of the heaviest matter in the universe. They also say that it takes close to 50 years for this small star to rotate Sirius. Astronomers were able to validate the existence of the secondary star, now called Sirius B, in 1862, and only about 30 years ago could they validate the rest of this information. The way that stars work, when they get really old, they have two options. They can go supernova, or it can blow up as a red giant, cause an explosion, and slowly collapse into a white dwarf. Sirius B is a white dwarf, which corresponds with what the Dogons say. White dwarfs are the smallest star type, estimated to weigh approximately 1.5 million tons per cubic inch. Black holes aside, that would surely seem to be the heaviest matter in the universe, or at least incredibly close. The Dogons were right on every aspect. Not only that, but when checking the rotational pattern of Sirius B around the larger star Sirius A, they found it to be 50.1 years. Now, this could not be a coincidence at all. It's just too close, too factual. Yet, how did an ancient primitive tribe know such detailed information about a star that could really only be measured in the last 30 years? And that's not all they knew. They also knew about the other planets in their solar system, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. They knew exactly what these planets looked like when you approach them from space, let alone from Earth. They knew about red and white blood cells, and had all kinds of physiological information about the human body. All of this from a primitive tribe. Naturally, a team of scientists went to the Dogons and asked how they knew all this. This was probably a mistake to these researchers, because if they accepted that the Dogons really have this information, then by default they must accept how they got it. The Dogons told them that a drawing on the cave wall showed them. The drawings show a flying saucer in its familiar shape coming out of the sky and landing on 3 legs. Then it shows the beings in the ship going into water and coming up to the edge of the water. These beings looked very much like dolphins. In fact, maybe they were dolphins, but we don't really know for certain. Then they started communicating with the Dogons. They described where they came from and gave the Dogon tribe the information. Here's another thing the Dogons knew. This little drawing was on the walls, but the scientists didn't know what the heck it was, until computers calculated the orbits of Sirius A and B. As seen from Earth, this pattern shown in the cave is identical to the pattern of Sirius B moving around Sirius A in a time frame between the years 1912 and 1990. These two times are actually kind of important. 1912 was the first year when we began communication with the Greys, and in 1990, a specific electromagnetic grid around the planet was formed. But we'll have to look at that later once we go over some other stuff first. Another thing about this rotation, it's the exact same rotational movement of DNA. Part 2. How old is the Sphinx? This is probably one of the most important discoveries on the planet ever. The first one to really discover this was R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz. He is a famous Egyptian archaeologist who has written many books. He and his stepdaughter, Lucy Lamy, have demonstrated a profound understanding of sacred geometry and Egyptian culture. Now, on the Sphinx, there are wear and cut patterns that are totally different from the patterns on other buildings in Egypt. Toward the back of the Sphinx, there are cuts 12 feet deep into the surface. This pattern appears to be smoothed by water, as opposed to all the other buildings and structures built by Egyptians, which are only textured by sand and wind. The last time that there was water in the Egypt area was over 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Scientists have determined that after the ice age, the Sphinx took a heavy beating, after which it was encased in sand for about 8,000 years. The face, however, was above the sand and continued to be weathered. The Egyptians didn't build the Sphinx, they merely restored it. Of course, Egyptologists have been slow to adapt to this new incredible discovery, but I think we know why. See, there are around 5,000 Egyptian archaeologists in the world, and they all pretty much agree with each other in most ways. They make little changes, but not too many, and most agree on the age of the pyramids. All of these archaeologists are Muslim, with a few exceptions, and their holy book is the Quran. Please understand that I'm not trying to discredit a major religion, but the Quran says that creation began about 6,000 years ago. So if a Muslim were to say that the building is 8,000 years old, he would be disputing their Bible. They cannot do that, and so they won't even talk about it. Another thing that's actually incredibly interesting, the Sphinx has a body like this, and a head like this? That's rather unproportional, isn't it? Not only that, but the Sphinx is actually facing a very specific direction. It is an astronomical marker. The Sphinx is in the shape of a lion. If it were built when Egyptologists say it was, that would be only 2,500 years ago, while the constellation of Taurus was in the sky. The only logical time for the Sphinx to be built when it was when the constellation Leo was in the sky, during the 11th millennia BC. The time that matches exactly where our new findings say that it would have been built. In the past, when something new like this was discovered that has a major influence on the viewpoint of the world, it takes about 100 years for it to get to the average person to say, oh yes, that's true. But this time, it's happening a lot quicker because of the internet. Now scientific circles are actually beginning to look at the words of Plato in a new light when he talked about another culture, another continent, from a dim past called Atlantis. The Sphinx is the largest sculpture on the planet. We know it was not done by hairy barbarians, but by a very sophisticated culture. And it was not done by anybody we now know here on Earth. From a scientific point of view, this is the first solid evidence to be accepted about the true age of civilization. There have been lots of other evidence, but it has kept being put under the table. Now we have the accepted evidence that there absolutely had to be someone on Earth who was highly civilized as early as 10,000 years ago. This is just the beginning of how we are going to completely change our view of who we think we are. At the end of lesson 6, I showed you some really cool geometrically perfect crop circles in the flower of life form. Most people didn't like that, or care. So instead, I offer you this. This intense drawing was done by Leonardo da Vinci, proving that he actually studied the flower of life form. In fact, over 200 drawings of his were found, all studying different angles and proportions, complete with descriptions of each one. The editor of the book who published these lost drawings didn't really know what they were, so he just said this is how he came up with his gear inventions. Leonardo was able to invent such intricate inventions and designs because he studied divine proportion. Also, Leonardo was a master mason, and it's clear that he most likely got his original knowledge from them. Is the flower of life, among other things, the secret information that the Masons have been keeping secret for the last 1,000 years? Today, I was going to look at spirals and sequences found all throughout the universe, which is pretty important, but at the last minute I decided to change it because I want to show you something else. Now, in the comments or end credits, depending on where you're watching this, I posted links to a TED Talks video by Garrett Lacey, a particle physicist who tells us of an amazing discovery in the scientific field. I want to show you and talk about his findings, and then we'll look at dimensions after that. Okay, so Garrett has discovered that by examining coral, they found that each coral head has thousands of different polyps. These polyps are constantly budding and branching into genetically identical neighbors. Through performing heat experiments on these polyps, they were able to find that every single polyp is part of a whole, a single unit of being, but each one is experiencing its own reality individually. From their findings with the coral, they were able to look at quantum mechanics. See, the mathematics of quantum mechanics shows us exactly how our universe works, and we see that everything in the reality is just continually branching into new possibilities, just like the coral. As humans, we are individually experiencing only one of these possibilities, much like the individual polyps. What physics is telling us is that everything comes down to geometry and the interactions between elementary particles. Things can happen only when things are perfectly balanced. So Garrett starts showing us some subatomic particles and the things that make up electrons and protons and neutrons. We always consider these to be the smallest particle, but we never think about what's creating them. Garrett demonstrates to us how the particles that create point particles really work. He shows that when you plot them out in how they move, this is what they look like. At the tiniest scales of the universe in how it works is very beautiful. Now, look at this. This is one of the ways that these charges branch off from each other. As you can see, it flows in a hexagonal pattern, the same pattern that we found in the expanded flower of life. Then, if you rotate this pattern in 6-dimensional charge space, you see it forms yet another pattern. Many of you will recognize this as the shape of the Star of David, but its true name is the star tetrahedron, which maps perfectly over the fruit of life. This entire pattern created by the particles is mapped across over precise places on a 200-dimensional spherical shape scientists have called E8, of which also has a geometric shape. By rotating that shape as well, you can see how there are nearly infinite possibilities as to how these elementary particles interact with each other. The details of the reality begin to take form. Now, as this shape is rotating in 8 dimensions, you can see a myriad of different patterns here. Look at this one in particular. This looks a lot like Metatron's cube, doesn't it? At the heart of particle physics is pure, beautiful geometry. By now, you probably can begin to see where sacred geometry falls into this. Where do these shapes originate? Do they just come into being at random? Or does the first shape come from somewhere else? In lesson 6, we talked about the flower of life, the original, perfect geometric symmetry that created the universe. This shape, as we learned, is not only the root of all mathematical proportion, light, the platonic solids, but is also the source of every musical system in the universe, including systems both used and unknown to modern man. It is also the source of energy patterns and, well, everything. It all comes from the flower of life. I believe this is what is at the heart of what's forming every subatomic particle formation, and it probably goes at least a few levels deeper than what Garrett is showing us.